It was October 2021, and I was leading a group of hikers up Crestview Trail in Mount Tamalpais State Park. The morning had started out calm enough. The sky was clear, the air crisp, and the group in good spirits. This was supposed to be a routine hike, a chance for me to get away from my thoughts and focus on the job. After the breakup, I'd taken on every tour I could, hoping the long hours would be enough to keep my mind occupied. Megan was part of the group. She was cautious, maybe too cautious, but I didn't blame her. First mountain trail, she said, and her friends had dragged her into it. She kept close, always within earshot, her eyes darting nervously to the side of the trail, as if expecting something to jump out of the trees. We'd been hiking for a couple of hours when things started to change. The fog rolled in suddenly, thick and heavy, settling around us like a blanket. I reassured the group, telling them it was typical for this time of year, but something about it felt different. The fog was disorienting, and the familiar markers, the ones I knew like the back of my hand, seemed off. They weren't where I remembered them. "Hey, Jake," Megan called, her voice tense. She was standing a few feet back, her friends beside her. "Are you sure we're going the right way? This doesn't look right." I forced a smile, trying to mask my unease. "It's fine, Megan. I've done this 100 times. Trust me." But even as I said it, I wasn't so sure. The fog was getting thicker, and the markers seemed out of place, almost like someone had moved them. I tried to push the thought away, but it lingered, gnawing at me. I couldn't let them see I was worried. Not now. "Stay here," I said, my voice firmer than I felt. "I'm going to scout ahead just to be sure. I'll be right back." Megan didn't look convinced, but she nodded, her arms crossed over her chest. I turned and headed up the trail, the fog swallowing me as I moved away from the group. I kept my eyes on the ground, searching for anything familiar, any sign that we were still on the right path. But the further I went, the more lost I felt. The markers were wrong. They weren't where they should be, and the trail seemed to twist in ways it never had before. I don't know how long I walked, but when I turned back, the group was gone. The fog was too thick, the trail too quiet. I called out, my voice swallowed by the mist. No answer. I kept moving, trying to find my way back, but nothing looked right. The markers were gone, and the trail seemed to lead nowhere. Back at the group, Megan was growing more anxious. Jake had been gone too long, and the fog was getting worse. She glanced at her friends, their faces mirroring her own fear. "We need to go back," she said, her voice shaking. "We can't just wait here." They hesitated, but eventually agreed. As they turned to backtrack, Megan spotted something on the ground, Jake's guide map, half buried in the dirt. She picked it up, her eyes widening as she saw the circles drawn on it, the words, "Do not enter," scrawled in Jake's handwriting over several areas of the trail. Panic set in as they moved, the fog making every step feel like a gamble. The trail seemed different now, more dangerous, and they had to rely on each other to keep from getting separated. The wind picked up, the cold biting at their skin as they stumbled through the mist, each step taking them further from where they'd last seen Jake. Hours later, they made it back to the trailhead, exhausted and shaken. There was no sign of Jake, no tracks, no gear, nothing. They reported him missing, and the rangers began their search, scouring the trail for any trace of him. Days passed, but all they found was a single trail marker, moved to the edge of a steep cliff, as if someone had deliberately placed it there. Megan couldn't shake the feeling that something had gone terribly wrong, that Jake had trusted too much in what he knew, in the familiarity of the trail. She knew he was experienced, but even the best guides could make mistakes. The fog, the misplaced markers, it was as if the trail itself had turned against them. In the weeks that followed, Megan became an advocate for stricter regulations on trail markers and guides. She spoke out about the importance of preparation, of understanding that even the most familiar paths could change without warning. Jake had been overconfident, and it had cost him, and nearly cost them, everything. The story of the disappearing guide on Crestview Trail became a cautionary tale, a reminder that nature was unpredictable, and that complacency could be just as dangerous as inexperience. And for Megan, it was a lesson she would carry with her for the rest of her life, that even the most seasoned hikers could find themselves lost if they stopped respecting the trail. Story 2. It was September 2019, and Lauren was finally ready to prove herself. Moving to Virginia had been a big step, and now, hiking Fox Hollow Path in Shenandoah National Park would be her next challenge. She'd prepared meticulously, packed all the right gear, studied the map, and read every safety guideline. This was her first solo trek, and she was determined to prove her independence. The day started well. The trail was beautiful, the air crisp, and Lauren could hear the rustle of leaves as a gentle breeze swept through the forest. She took deep breaths, trying to steady the anxious flutter in her chest. Everything seemed normal until she began hearing a faint humming sound, almost like a distant machine, continuous and low. She paused, listening, but shook it off as her imagination, maybe nerves getting the better of her. But as she continued, the sound grew louder. It wasn't constant, more like an intermittent vibration that seemed to move with her. Lauren tried to ignore it, but it gnawed at her nerves, the hairs on her arms standing on end. The sound didn't have a source she could see. It was just there, surrounding her. A couple of hours into the hike, she spotted a park ranger coming towards her, his uniform a comforting sight amid the growing unease. "Hey there," he greeted, his voice friendly. "Everything all right?" Lauren hesitated for a moment before speaking. "Actually, I've been hearing this strange humming noise. I thought maybe it was just me, but it's been following me for a while now." The ranger, whose name tag read Ben, smiled reassuringly. "Could be a lot of things. Sometimes the wind plays tricks, especially around here. I'll walk with you for a bit, just to check it out." Relief washed over Lauren as Ben fell into step beside her. They continued along the trail, making small talk. Ben was calm, his demeanor putting her at ease. But then the humming returned, louder now, almost vibrating through the air. Ben paused, frowning slightly, his eyes narrowing as he looked around. "That's odd," he muttered. Before Lauren could respond, a new sound joined the humming. Faint echoes of laughter, high-pitched and eerie, followed by what sounded like distant cries. Lauren's heart pounded, her breath quickening as panic clawed at her chest. "What is that?" she whispered, her eyes wide as she scanned the trees. The sounds seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, bouncing off the dense forest, impossible to pin down. Ben's expression hardened, his previous calm now replaced with something else, something that looked a lot like concern. "Could be sound carrying from a campsite," he said, but there was an edge to his voice that hadn't been there before. He motioned for them to keep moving, his pace quicker now. They reached a narrow part of the trail, the sounds growing almost deafening. The humming, the laughter, the cries, it all blended together, a chaotic symphony that made Lauren's head spin. Ben stopped abruptly, his face pale. "We're turning back," he said, his voice firm. "Now." Lauren didn't argue. They retraced their steps, the oppressive sounds fading as they moved further from the narrow passage. By the time they made it back to a wider part of the trail, the forest had gone silent again, the only sound their labored breathing. Once they were safely back at the trailhead, Ben turned to Lauren, his expression serious. "Sound can do strange things out here," he said. "The wind, the terrain. It can carry noises from miles away, amplify them, twist them. I've heard it happen before, but never like that. That was something else." Lauren nodded, still shaken but grateful to be back. The experience had rattled her, but it had also given her a new respect for the unpredictability of nature. She'd come out here to prove her independence, but she'd learned that the wilderness had its own rules, rules that didn't care about her confidence or her plans. Ben took the incident seriously. In the weeks that followed, he pushed for new guidelines, warning hikers about the potential for amplified, inexplicable sounds along certain trails. He wanted to make sure that people understood the risks, not some romanticized ghost story, but the real, unsettling power of nature. For Lauren, the hike had been a lesson in humility. She still wanted to explore, still wanted to prove herself, but she knew now that independence didn't mean ignoring fear. It meant respecting it, understanding that sometimes the best thing you could do was turn back and live to hike another day. Story 3. It was July 2020, and the sun was beginning to dip below the peaks of the Smoky Mountains as Derek led his group along Larkspur Trail. The twilight hike was supposed to be a peaceful one, the fading light casting long shadows through the trees. But Derek knew better than to let his guard down. He'd spent years as a firefighter, and even though he was now retired, the instinct to stay alert never quite left him. Emma was lagging behind, as usual. She was a social media influencer, her phone always in hand, snapping pictures of every angle, every view. Derek had warned her at the start of the hike to pay attention to the trail, but she just smiled, telling him she needed the perfect shot for her followers. He'd seen her type before, focused on aesthetics, not practicality. He tried not to let it bother him, but the trail was narrow, and distractions could be dangerous. They'd reached the midpoint of the hike when Emma suddenly stopped. She looked around, her expression shifting from focused to uneasy. Derek glanced back, raising an eyebrow. "You all right, Emma?" I don't know," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It feels like someone's watching us, not just someone, a lot of people." Derek sighed, waving the rest of the group to keep moving. He walked back to where Emma stood, her eyes darting around the forest. "It's twilight," he said, his voice calm. "The shadows, the way the light moves, it can mess with your head. Makes you feel like there's something there when there's not." Emma nodded, but she didn't look convinced. She fell back into step behind Derek, her eyes still scanning the trees. The group continued, the trail getting narrower as they approached a rock ledge. The air was cooling, the sounds of the forest changing as night settled in. It was then that Emma heard it. A whisper, faint but unmistakable, followed by the sound of footsteps, like a crowd moving just beyond the tree line. She froze, her heart pounding. "Derek!" she called, her voice sharp with panic. Derek turned just in time to see her stumble, her eyes wide with fear. "What is it?" he asked, moving quickly towards her. "Someone pushed me," she said, her voice trembling. "I swear I felt someone push me." Derek reached out, steadying her. He looked around, his eyes narrowing as he listened. There was nothing, no movement, no sound beyond the rustle of leaves. But Emma's fear was palpable, and he knew better than to dismiss it entirely. "All right, let's keep moving," he said, his voice firm. "Stay close to me." They moved along the ledge, Derek keeping a careful eye on Emma. She was shaken, her usual confidence replaced by a nervous energy that made her steps uncertain. As they finally made it past the narrow section, Emma let out a shaky breath, her eyes glistening with tears. Derek stopped, turning to face her. "You need to focus, Emma. This trail, it doesn't care about your followers or your photos. One wrong step and you're done. Got it?" Emma nodded, wiping her eyes. "I'm sorry," she whispered. I thought I felt something." "I know," Derek said, his voice softening. "But out here, you've got to trust what's real. Not the shadows, not the whispers, just what you can see and feel under your feet." They made it back to the trailhead as the last light faded from the sky. The rest of the group was tired but relieved, chatting quietly as they headed to their cars. Emma lingered, her phone in her hand, replaying the footage she'd taken earlier. The images were shaky, the light dim, but she could see herself, could see the moment she stumbled, her face twisted in fear. There was no one behind her, no one who could have pushed her. She looked up at Derek, who was packing away his gear. "You were right," she said, her voice subdued. "I wasn't paying attention. I could have gotten us both hurt." Derek nodded, his expression serious. "It's not just about you out here, Emma. Every step you take affects the people around you. You've got to respect that." In the weeks that followed, Derek enforced stricter rules on his hikes. No phones, no distractions, especially on narrow or dangerous trails. He knew the power of perception, how easily the mind could play tricks, especially in the fading light of twilight. And for Emma, the experience was a wake-up call. She still wanted to share her adventures, still wanted the perfect shot, but she knew now that her safety, and the safety of those around her, came first. The story of the unseen crowd on Larkspur Trail became a reminder for all of them that the real danger wasn't what you imagined in the shadows, but what you missed right in front of you when your focus slipped. Story 4. It was April 2022, and the night was cool as Jason and Leah set out on Cedar Bend Trail in the Adirondack Mountains. Jason, a 29-year-old amateur wildlife photographer, was eager to capture some rare nocturnal wildlife shots. Leah, his friend, and an experienced hiker, was there to keep him grounded. She didn't love the idea of night hikes, but she indulged Jason's fascination, trusting her own skills to keep them safe. The trail was quiet, the only sound the crunch of their boots on the gravel and the distant rustle of leaves. Jason had his camera ready, his eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. Leah stayed close, her flashlight illuminating the path ahead. She was cautious, always aware of where they were and how far they'd gone, her instincts sharp. Around midnight, Jason paused, his camera pointed at something in the distance. "Do you see that?" he whispered, nodding towards the woods off the trail. Leah followed his gaze, squinting into the darkness. There, deep in the woods, were faint flashes of light, like flashlights flickering, moving erratically. "Probably other hikers," Leah said, though her brow furrowed. "But it's weird, there weren't any other groups registered for the night." Jason's eyes lit up, curiosity piqued. "Could be something interesting," he said, already stepping off the trail. Leah grabbed his arm. "Jason, no! We shouldn't go off trail," she warned, but Jason shook her off, his camera ready. "I just want to check it out. I'll be quick." Leah sighed, but she followed him, her flashlight cutting through the darkness. The lights ahead flickered again, disappearing for a moment before reappearing further along, deeper into the woods. It was disorienting. Each time they thought they were getting closer, the light seemed to move, always just out of reach. "This doesn't feel right," Leah said, her voice tense. "We need to go back, Jason. We're getting too far off the trail." Jason hesitated, but the look on Leah's face made him pause. She was right. They were off trail, and the lights were leading them further into unfamiliar territory. He nodded, turning back the way they'd come, but the woods looked different now. The path they'd made was gone, swallowed by the darkness, and the flickering lights had vanished. They started back, Leah leading the way, her eyes scanning for anything familiar, but the forest seemed to twist around them, each turn looking like the last. Then, suddenly, the lights appeared again, closer this time, flickering just beyond a cluster of trees. "Jason," Leah said, her voice shaking, "we're lost." Jason swallowed, the reality of their situation sinking in. He pulled out his phone, but there was no signal. Leah took a deep breath, steadying herself. "I'm calling the Rangers," she said, pulling out her emergency beacon. Jason didn't argue. It felt like hours before they saw the beams of the Rangers' flashlights cutting through the trees. Relief washed over Leah, her shoulders sagging as the Rangers approached, guiding them back to the trail. Once they were safely at the trailhead, one of the Rangers explained what had happened. "Those lights you saw, they're reflections," he said. "It's a phenomenon we get around here sometimes. The headlights from the highway bounce through the gaps in the trees. It's disorienting, especially at night. You're not the first to get turned around because of it." Jason nodded, his face pale. He'd wanted an adventure, but this had been more than he'd bargained for. Leah looked at him, her expression serious. "No more off-trail at night," she said. "It's not worth it." Jason didn't argue. He knew she was right. The experience had shaken him, the realization that even something as simple as a light could lead them so far off course. He'd always thought of himself as cautious, but he understood now that the wilderness had its own way of testing you. In the days that followed, the park posted new warnings about the lights on Cedar Bend Trail, advising hikers to stay on the path and not to follow any strange lights they might see. For Jason, it was a humbling reminder of the unpredictability of nature, of the illusions that could turn even a seasoned adventurer around. And for Leah, it was proof that sometimes, indulging a friend's fascination came with risks she wasn't willing to take again. Story 5. It was June 2023, and the sun was high over the Bitterroot Mountains as Sam led his group along Trail 47. Sam, a 30-year-old seasonal worker, had recently started guiding as a new job. He wasn't familiar with all the trails yet, but he was confident in his navigational skills. This was supposed to be a straightforward hike, one that offered expansive views and some rocky terrain. Among the group was Lily, a 45-year-old mother of 3 who had taken up hiking recently as a personal challenge and a way to relax. The trail was quiet, the group moving at a steady pace. Sam pointed out landmarks as they went, his confidence evident even if he was still learning the area. Lily was enjoying the hike, taking in the scenery and letting herself unwind. The mountains were beautiful, the air fresh, and she felt a sense of peace as they moved further along the trail. Halfway through the hike, a loud rustling sound broke the calm. Sam paused, his head turning towards the noise. It was coming from around the bend, and it was getting louder. He signaled for the group to stop, his eyes narrowing as he listened. "What is that?" Lily asked, her voice laced with curiosity and a hint of concern. Before Sam could answer, they rounded the bend and found themselves face to face with an unexpected sight. A cattle drive. A large herd of cattle, their eyes wide and their movements erratic, was barreling down the trail towards them. The animals were clearly spooked, their hooves thundering against the rocky ground, and there was nowhere for the group to go. "Get to the side!" Sam shouted, his voice rising above the noise. He led the group towards a narrow ledge, pressing them against the rocky hillside. Lily's heart pounded as she crouched down, her back against the rock, the cattle passing within inches of them. The noise was deafening, the ground shaking beneath them as the herd moved past, the animals' eyes wild with panic. Lily glanced at Sam, her eyes wide with fear. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice barely audible over the chaos. "Stay still," Sam said, his own fear masked by the need to stay in control. He kept his eyes on the cattle, his body tense as he shielded one of the hikers beside him. The herd seemed endless, the animals moving in a frantic wave, but eventually, the last of them passed, leaving the trail in chaos, dust hanging in the air, the ground littered with rocks dislodged by the stampede. Sam let out a breath, his shoulders sagging as the noise faded. He turned to the group, his expression apologetic. "I'm sorry," he said. "I didn't know we were in an open grazing area. It's cattle driving season, I should have checked." Lily nodded, her hands still trembling slightly. "I've never been that close to cattle before," she said, her voice shaky. "That was terrifying." They made their way back to the trailhead, the group quieter now, the adrenaline still wearing off. Sam couldn't shake the feeling of responsibility, the realization that his lack of local knowledge had put everyone at risk. Once they were safely back, he pulled out his phone, determined to research the area more thoroughly. He needed to know the grazing schedules, the local hazards, everything that could affect the safety of his hikes. In the days that followed, Sam made changes. He implemented mandatory checks on trail conditions, grazing schedules, and any other external factors that could impact his hikes. He knew that confidence alone wasn't enough. He needed to be prepared, to understand the land he was leading people through. The story of the unexpected cattle drive on Trail 47 became a reminder for Sam and his group that the wilderness was unpredictable, and that even the best plans could be upended by things you didn't account for. For Lily, it was a lesson in the real risks of rural hiking, a reminder that nature had its own way of challenging you, and that sometimes the best thing you could do was to be ready for the unexpected.